I stepped out of the car, and right away, I felt something was off. I'd been to 100 of these events before, but this time, the air was different. People weren't rushing up to greet me. No cameras swung in my direction. Instead, there was a hesitation in the air, like everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The red carpet stretched out in front of me, a river of flashing lights and moving bodies. I adjusted my jacket, ran a hand through my hair, and started walking. The sound of voices mixed with the clicks of cameras, the hum of a city that never really slept. Then, right as I reached the entrance, a security guard stepped forward, his hand flat like a stop sign. "Sorry, sir. You're not on the list." I almost laughed. I've been coming to these things for longer than this kid had been alive. But he wasn't smiling, and neither were the people behind him. "Check again," I said, keeping my voice steady. He didn't move. "I've checked, sir. You're not cleared for entry." My jaw tightened. "Son, you know who I am?" His expression didn't change. "Yes, sir. I do." And that's when it hit me. This wasn't a mistake. This was something else. A murmur rippled through the crowd behind me. People noticed. A few heads turned. A reporter whispered something to his cameraman. My name was starting to pass through lips like an unanswered question. I could feel the weight of their stares pressing in, waiting to see what I'd do next. I wasn't about to make a scene, but I wasn't walking away either. I took a slow step closer, just enough that the guard had to look up at me. "Who gave the order?" For the first time, he hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the entrance. Not long, just a second, but I caught it. Someone inside had made this call. I exhaled sharply through my nose, shook my head. That's a shame. The guard shifted on his feet. He wasn't a bad kid, just following orders. But that didn't make this any easier to swallow. Behind me, the crowd was growing. More whispers, more phones coming up. I knew what was happening. The cameras weren't just pointed at the stars on the carpet anymore. Some of them were aimed right at me. Then I heard it. "Hey, wait, is that Clint Eastwood?" A young guy, maybe a reporter, maybe just someone in the crowd. But his voice was loud enough to spread. More people turned. More eyes locked on me. The energy shifted. I could feel the moment stretching, hanging on a thread. I wasn't angry. Not yet. But I was damn sure ready for answers. And whoever was behind that door, they'd better have a good one. "Hey, wait, is that Clint Eastwood?" The words cut through the noise like a bullet. The crowd shifted, bodies turning, whispers growing. I could feel it happening. That slow ripple of attention, spreading from one person to the next, like a wave gaining strength before it crashes. I stood there, still as stone, my boots planted firm on the pavement just before the red carpet. The security guard hadn't moved, still standing there with his hand resting near his belt. The others around him, men in black suits, earpieces curling behind their ears, exchanged quick glances, but no one spoke. A camera flash popped in the corner of my eye. Then another. I didn't react, didn't blink. I'd been in standoffs before. This one just didn't have the smell of dust and gunpowder. A young reporter broke away from the crowd, stepping closer. He was barely 30, hair combed neat, a press badge hanging from his neck. He clutched a microphone in one hand and his phone in the other, the screen already recording. "Mr. Eastwood, is this real?" His voice was quick, eager. "They're not letting you in?" I glanced at him, just for a second, just enough to let him know I'd heard. But I didn't answer. Not yet. Silence can do more than words when used right. The kid swallowed, then tried again. "Sir, is there a reason they won't let you in? Are you being banned?" Banned. That word hung in the air, pulling another murmur from the crowd. I turned my head slightly, just enough to meet the guard's eyes again. His jaw was set tight. He looked straight ahead, past me, over me, like I wasn't standing right there. Something cold settled in my chest. This wasn't a mistake. People moved closer. Phones lifted. A few more cameras turned in my direction. I heard my name pass from one person to the next, each voice a little sharper, a little more surprised. A woman's voice cut through the noise. "Mr. Eastwood, sir, I'll handle this." I looked to my right. A woman in a sleek black dress hurried forward, her heels clicking against the pavement. Angela Carter, event coordinator. I recognized her from a few past events. Always professional, always smiling. But not now. Now, her face was tight, her eyes darting between me and the security team. She reached the guard and leaned in, speaking in a whisper just loud enough for me to catch a few words. This misunderstanding let him through. The guard barely moved. He shook his head once. A small, sharp motion. Angela stiffened. "Are you serious?" she hissed. I watched her carefully. She wasn't expecting this either. That meant something. The reporter took a step closer. "Ma'am, can you clarify? Why is Clint Eastwood being denied entry?" Angela turned, pressing her lips together. I took the moment to speak, my voice even. "That's a good question." More flashes. More eyes. Angela hesitated, just long enough to make it clear she didn't have an answer ready. And in that moment, I knew whatever was happening here, it was bigger than just a name missing from a list. It wasn't a mistake. It was something else. And I was about to find out exactly what. A low murmur ran through the crowd. The flashes of cameras started coming quicker, each one a sharp crack of light in the growing tension. I stood still, watching Angela shift uncomfortably as the guard remained firm. No one spoke for a moment, the space between us stretching tighter with every second. Then, from just beyond the velvet rope, I heard a voice. Clint. It was familiar but off. The kind of voice you recognize, but not in the way you remember. I turned my head and saw him standing just inside the entrance. Tom Jacobs. I hadn't seen Tom in years, but I knew that face like an old photograph tucked away in a drawer. Time had sharpened his features, given him the kind of confidence that comes from sitting behind desks instead of in front of cameras. His suit was perfect, his smile controlled. He stepped forward, his hands in his pockets, stopping just short of the guard. "I didn't think you'd actually show up," he said. There was something behind his tone, something knowing. I let the words sit for a moment before I answered. "Didn't think I'd show up, or made sure I wouldn't?" Tom chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Come on, Clint. Let's not do this here." Angela turned to him quickly, her voice tight. "Tom, there's been some kind of—" "There's no misunderstanding," Tom interrupted, his eyes locked on mine. This was a decision. A decision. He wanted me to hear that. He wanted me to know. I stayed quiet, studying him. The way he stood, the way he smiled just enough to look in control, but not enough to seem open. Tom had changed since the days when we used to talk about movies like they meant something. Now, he was the kind of man who spoke in careful words, the kind who could shake your hand while cutting you off at the knees. "Nothing personal," Tom said finally. That was the line people used when it was absolutely personal. I exhaled slowly. "Is that right?" Tom glanced at Angela. "You can go." She hesitated. "Tom, go." She looked at me, something uneasy in her expression, then turned and walked back toward the entrance. I watched her go, then looked back at Tom. "So," I said, keeping my voice steady, "what exactly is the decision here?" Tom lifted a hand, gesturing slightly to the flashing cameras, the murmuring crowd. "You know how this town is. Always looking ahead. Always thinking about what's next." I let him talk. Sometimes, people say more when you let them think they're in control. "Things are changing, Clint," Tom continued. "Studios, investors, audiences, they want something new. Something fresh. We're moving in a different direction." I nodded slowly. "A different direction." He smiled, but his eyes were sharp. "You've had a hell of a run, but maybe it's time to ride off into the sunset." There it was, the quiet nudge toward the door. The polite way of saying I wasn't part of the picture anymore. I felt a flicker of something deep in my chest. Not anger, not yet, but close. I took a slow step forward. Not enough to be aggressive, just enough to make sure he was looking right at me when I spoke. "Tell me something, Tom." My voice was calm, steady. "Did you ever really respect this business? Or did you just learn how to use it?" Tom's smile flickered just for a second. Then, just as quickly, it was back. "This isn't personal, Clint," he said again. "It's just how things go." I held his gaze. Let the weight of the moment settle. Then I smiled. Just a little. Just enough. "We'll see about that." And then, behind us, someone in the crowd shouted my name. "Clint." The voice cut through the noise, sharp and urgent. The cameras turned. The murmurs grew louder, but I didn't move right away. I kept my eyes on Tom. His face stayed neutral, that same polished expression he always wore when he wanted to look like he had nothing to hide. But something in his posture changed. Just a little. just enough for me to know he wasn't as comfortable as he wanted to be. I finally turned my head, looking toward the woman who had called my name. Angela. She was standing just beyond the security team, shifting on her feet, her hands clasped together like she wasn't sure if she should step forward or not. The flashing cameras made her face look paler than before. She was nervous. I didn't say anything, just let the moment stretch. She swallowed, took a breath, and then finally walked toward me. Clint, she said again, quieter this time. I need to explain. Tom sighed behind me. Angela, don't. But she cut him off, her voice stronger now. No, Tom. He deserves to hear it. That got my attention. I turned fully toward her now, watching the way she looked at me, then away, like she wasn't sure where to begin. I waited. Finally, she spoke. There was pressure, she said, voice barely above a whisper. From the studio, from the sponsors. They wanted a fresh image for this event. She exhaled. They thought maybe it was time to... She stopped. She couldn't even say it. I finished for her. Move on. Angela flinched. Clint, I fought for you. I swear I did. I tilted my head slightly. And yet, here we are. Her face fell. I didn't have a choice. That was the part that got me. Not the decision itself. I'd been in Hollywood long enough to know how things worked. But hearing those words from someone I thought I could trust, that was different. Angela had been at my side for years, coordinating events, handling press, making sure everything ran smooth. And now, when it mattered, she let them push me aside like I was nothing more than an old name on a list. I looked at her carefully. You knew, didn't you? Angela hesitated. Days ago, I continued. Maybe even weeks. Her silence was answer enough. The weight of it settled in my chest. It wasn't anger, not yet. Just disappointment. A kind that sat deep, colder than anything else. Tom stepped forward again, his voice smooth, controlled. Clint, this doesn't have to be ugly. It's just business. I turned back to him, met his gaze. Is that what you tell yourself? Tom didn't flinch. Things change. I let out a slow breath. Looked at Angela one last time. Yeah, I said. They sure do. Then I turned away. But before I could take a step, something unexpected happened. The crowd started clapping. Not for Tom. The sound started small. A single pair of hands clapping somewhere in the crowd. It was slow at first, almost hesitant, like whoever started it wasn't sure if they should. Then another joined in, and another, until suddenly it was everywhere. A wave of applause rolled through the crowd, voices rising with it. Let him in, someone shouted. This is Clint Eastwood. More voices, more cameras turning. The energy shifted fast, from confusion to something stronger, something undeniable. I didn't move, didn't react right away. I just let it happen, let it grow. Tom stiffened beside me, his practiced calm starting to crack. His eyes darted toward the entrance, like he was already trying to figure out a way to control the situation. Angela was frozen in place, her face pale under the flashing lights. The security guards exchanged uneasy glances, their earpieces crackling as someone inside tried to figure out what to do. The young reporter from earlier, Jake, I think his name was, pushed closer, his phone still recording. Mr. Eastwood, how does it feel to have the crowd standing up for you? I finally turned my head, looking at him. He was eager, his eyes bright, but there was something else too. Something real. I thought about what to say. Then, I gave him the truth. They remember. Jake's brow furrowed. Remember what? I let my gaze sweep over the crowd, at the people calling my name, at the ones clapping, the ones looking at me like I mattered. That this town wasn't built on pushing people out, I said. It was built on respect. The crowd roared in agreement. Tom took a step closer, lowering his voice. Clint, this is getting out of hand. I turned back to him, taking my time. Out of hand, I echoed. Or out of your control. Tom clenched his jaw. You think a little noise is going to change anything? He gestured toward the entrance, toward the studio executives inside, the ones who had made this call. They don't care about this, he said. You can have every person out here screaming your name, and it won't matter. They make the rules now. I held his gaze, let the weight of his words settle. Then I smiled, just enough to let him know I saw right through him. We'll see, I said. And at that moment, a voice boomed over the chaos. Let him in. The crowd fell silent, just for a second. Then they erupted. The words cut through the noise like a gunshot. "Let him in." The crowd froze for half a second, like everyone had to make sure they actually heard it. Then the applause roared back, louder this time, fueled by something stronger than before. The people weren't just supporting me now. They were demanding something. I turned toward the voice. A man stepped forward from the entrance, pushing past the stunned security team. He wasn't just anybody. He was the kind of person who didn't need to raise his voice twice to be heard. Samuel Pierce, director, producer, a man who'd spent decades shaping this town, just like I had. A man who knew what mattered and what didn't. And right now, he was looking straight at me, his expression unreadable. Tom stiffened beside me. I didn't need to look at him to know what he was thinking. Samuel wasn't supposed to be here. At least, not in this way. Not getting involved in something like this. But here he was. Samuel took another step forward, adjusting the sleeves of his tuxedo like he had all the time in the world. He glanced at Tom briefly, then back at me. "You coming or what?" A slow grin pulled at the corner of my mouth. I didn't need an invitation. I never had. But I wasn't about to turn one down either. Tom exhaled sharply through his nose, stepping towards Samuel. "Look, this isn't your call." Samuel didn't even blink. "Is that right?" Tom's jaw tightened. "The studio." Samuel cut him off with a quiet chuckle. "Oh, I know what the studio wants. I know what a lot of people want. But you see, there's something you don't get, Tom." Tom crossed his arms. "Enlighten me." Samuel took his time. He looked around, letting his eyes sweep over the crowd, the flashing cameras, the energy in the air. Then, finally, he turned back to Tom. "You don't get to decide what this town remembers." The crowd erupted again. Samuel waited for the noise to settle, then spoke again, his voice steady. "You can put whatever names you want on a list. You can try to shape the future however you like. But some things—" He gestured toward me. "Some things are bigger than whatever game you're playing." Tom didn't respond right away. I watched him carefully. I could see the calculations running through his mind. The way he was trying to figure out his next move, trying to see if he still had control of the situation. He didn't. The moment had already slipped through his fingers. Angela shifted nervously beside him, glancing between us. The security guards stood uncertain, waiting for an order that wasn't coming. And then, for the first time all night, Tom Jacobs had nothing to say. Samuel turned back to me. "You coming?" I adjusted my jacket, took my time. Then, with one last look at Tom, I stepped forward. The crowd parted, opening a path to the entrance. The security guards moved aside without a word. And just like that, I walked past the velvet rope. But as I stepped inside, I could feel it. This wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, the energy inside shifted. The cameras outside kept flashing, but in here, the light was different. Softer. Controlled. The kind of glow that belonged to Hollywood's elite, where everything was polished, curated, and designed to keep up appearances. I kept walking. Samuel Pierce matched my pace, a quiet force at my side. I could feel eyes turning toward us, some curious, some cautious, some whispering to each other like they'd just seen a ghost walk in. But the real weight wasn't in the crowd. It was behind us. Tom. I didn't have to look back to know he was standing frozen at the entrance, fists clenched at his sides, jaw tight. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go for him. He had expected a quiet dismissal, a footnote in the evening's events, not a headline. And certainly not this. Samuel leaned in slightly as we walked, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "You ready for this?" I glanced at him. "Always." We stepped into the main hall, and the murmurs spread like ripples in a still pond. Faces I'd known for decades turned my way, some smiling, some guarded. At the center of it all, a long, sleek table filled with executives, producers, and power players. And at the head of that table, the studio head, Lawrence Shaw. He was an old-school Hollywood type, slick, smooth, and always 3 moves ahead of everyone else. He lifted a glass of whiskey as I approached, giving me the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Clint," he said smoothly, "this is a surprise." I stopped at the edge of the table, Samuel taking a seat beside me. I didn't sit. Not yet. Lawrence gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Join us." I let a slow silence settle before answering. Funny, I said. Didn't think I was invited. A few of the executives shifted uncomfortably. Lawrence just chuckled, swirling his drink. There must have been some miscommunication. I met his gaze steady. Yeah, I said. Seems to be a lot of that going around. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The music from the stage in the distance filled the silence. Then, just as expected, Tom appeared at the edge of the gathering, still trying to look like he had control of the situation. Lawrence held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Tom, he gestured to the table. Have a seat. Tom hesitated. He had expected Lawrence to back him up, to brush this all under the rug. But instead, Lawrence was watching me, studying me. I could feel it, the shift. He was waiting to see my next move. I glanced at Samuel, who simply sat back, watching with quiet amusement. He knew the game as well as I did, and he knew what was coming next. I reached into my jacket, pulled out a small folded paper, and slid it onto the table. Lawrence raised an eyebrow, then picked it up, unfolding it slowly. As his eyes scanned the contents, his expression barely changed, but I caught it. The flicker, the small pause. I leaned in slightly. Your contract, I said. With me. The executives at the table sat up straighter. Even Tom took a small step forward, eyes darting between me and Lawrence. I kept my voice calm, steady. You could shut a door in my face. You could try to pretend I don't belong here. But you can't rewrite history, Lawrence. Not when it's in black and white. Lawrence set the paper down slowly, resting his hand on it. Clint, he said, still keeping that same smooth tone. You know how this business works. I gave a small nod. I do. And then I lean back, which is why I know you don't want to turn this into something bigger than it already is. Lawrence's jaw tightened just slightly. I gestured toward the entrance, because right now, there's an entire crowd outside waiting to see what happens next. There are cameras rolling. And if you want to be the guy who tried to erase Clint Eastwood from Hollywood, be my guest. I tilted my head. But I don't think that's the story you want on the front page tomorrow. Silence. A long, heavy pause. Then Lawrence did something unexpected. He smiled. Not the polite kind. Not the kind he used at business dinners or in carefully rehearsed interviews. The kind of man gives when he knows he just got outplayed. He picked up his whiskey, took a sip, then nodded toward the chair across from him. Sit down, Clint. And just like that, the power shifted. I didn't sit right away. I let the moment hang there, let the weight of it settle on everyone at that table. They were watching me, waiting, trying to figure out if I'd take the seat Lawrence had just offered. But that wasn't the point. The point was I didn't need to. The power had already shifted. Lawrence knew it. Tom knew it. And so did I. The only question left was what I wanted to do with it. I placed both hands on the back of the chair in front of me, not pulling it out, not sitting down, just resting there. The quiet stretched longer, the air so still you could almost hear the distant hum of the cameras still rolling outside. Then I spoke. I didn't come here to beg for a seat at this table. A few people shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Lawrence. But he didn't interrupt. I looked directly at him. I came to remind you who built it. His fingers tapped lightly against the rim of his glass, but he didn't look away. He wasn't going to win this one, and he knew it. I could see Tom shifting in the background, his hands clenched into fists. He was still trying to salvage something, still hoping Lawrence would take his side. But this was bigger than Tom now. The people in this room weren't just executives and producers. They were the ones who made decisions about what Hollywood looked like, about which faces stayed in the lights, and which ones faded into the background. And tonight, they were being forced to remember. Samuel Pierce finally leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a slight smirk playing at his lips. He had seen a lot in this town, but even he seemed entertained by how this had played out. You always did know how to deliver a good monologue, he murmured. I allowed myself the ghost of a smile. Then I pushed the chair back in. I've said what I needed to say. A few heads turned as I stepped away from the table, my movements slow, deliberate. Nobody tried to stop me. Angela was standing a few steps away, her expression unreadable. I met her eyes just long enough to see the regret there, the unspoken apology. Maybe she had meant what she said outside. Maybe she really had fought for me. But at the end of the day, fighting wasn't the same as winning. And that was the difference between us. I turned toward the exit, walking past Tom without so much as a glance. He stiffened as I passed, his jaw locked tight. He had lost more than just this battle tonight. He had lost the one thing a man like him couldn't afford to, his grip on the story. I stepped back out into the cool night air, and the second I did, the crowd erupted. People were still there, waiting, cheering. Jake, the young reporter, pushed closer, his phone still recording. Mr. Eastwood, Mr. Eastwood, what happened in there? I paused just long enough to let the moment breathe. Then I gave him the truth. Hollywood moves fast, I said. But some things don't fade. The crowd roared. And without another word, I walked on. Thank you for listening to another exciting story from VIP Vault. If you have enjoyed listening to this story, check out our videos here.